And before we get started, I want to remind everyone that if you have any questions, to put them in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go to questions and we can have everyone, the speakers, respond to those questions. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our three speakers. First is Dr. Rafael Canizares, and he has been working in the field of coastal engineering and flood management for more than 25 years. He previously served as a subject matter expert at the Engineering and Modeling Division of FEMA, RMD, where he participated in the planning of the future developments of the Risk Map program. He is now part of the BRIC Technical Services team, overseeing the technical feasibility of the BRIC applications. He has a PE in civil engineering from Madrid, Spain, a Master of Science and a PhD in the Netherlands. And then our second speaker is Marissa Ramos. And Marissa is a public utility supervisor within the Florida Public Service Commission's Division of Engineering. She currently supervises the reliability section, which processes a variety of docketed and undocketed matters pertaining to rate cases, environmental compliance, certification, and storm preparedness. She began her career at the Florida Public Service Commission 7 years ago, designing rates and charges for regulated water and wastewater utilities. Marissa received both her bachelor's degree in economics and political science, as well as her master's degree in business administration from Florida State University. She is originally from Fort Lauderdale and currently resides in Crawfordville, Florida. In true Floridian fashion, Marissa enjoys spending her free time at the beach or boating with her husband and their son. And our third speaker is Dean Catliff, and he is a staff engineer with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities in the Division of Water and Energy. His experience with the board began in utility, emergency management, and security, but then moved to the review of capital projects from the regulated electric and gas industries for rate cases and infrastructure investment projects. So these are our three speakers. And so without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Rafael to provide his presentation and information.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you everybody that is attending this webinar. I would like first to provide you with some background about the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community Program, BRIC, which is the program that I'm involved with. And I will also give you during the presentation some information about the flood mitigation activities that are funded through BRIC and other programs that are part of FEMA that can also be considered as for flood mitigation grants. So in 2018, the Disaster Recovery Act, Reform Act, amended the Stafford Act, which is what funded FEMA or created FEMA and authorized us to create the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Community BRIC mitigation program. The main thing of the program is to support greater investment in mitigation, planning, and projects before a disaster. And that is the main goal, to do it before a disaster and really focus on mitigation. So the idea was to provide a more stable, predictable, and dedicated funding source for hazard mitigation grants. It also simplified and streamlined the future implementation of the program and the priorities and the awarding of the program funds. This program is a continuous improvement program, so every year it changes based on what we learned from the previous cycle. The BRIC program aims to categorically shift the federal focus away from what we have been typically doing, which is react to disasters, and then put the funds and spending money once the disaster occurs. And the idea is to move it into a research-supported proactive investment in community resilience. And of course, this is a conclusion that came from multiple reports that you probably are aware, showing that natural hazard mitigation saves in the order of $6 on average for every dollar we spend in mitigation. So the way that BRIC is funded is a set aside from the Federal Disaster Relief Fund that equals 6% of the aggregate amount of the federal disaster grants provided each year. So every year changes, of course, because it depends what have been the previous disasters. So this has been already the case for the 3 cycles that the program has been already active. And as I said, it's only 3 cycles, so this is a young program. And right now we are reviewing sub-applications of the 3rd cycle and preparing the notice of funding opportunity for the 4th. BRIC encourages innovation and innovative projects that meets multiple program priorities. And at the same time, it also encourages to bring funding sources from private and public sector partners into these projects that we are going to be funded between multiple sources. The main program priorities are to mitigate the risk of natural hazards to infrastructure, and that also includes natural infrastructure. Benefiting disadvantaged communities, and BRIC is one of the first programs that has participated in the Justice 40 initiative from the White House in the Executive Order 14008. Also, we encourage the incorporation of nature-based solution into the mitigation solutions, and also designed to reduce carbon emissions. We want projects that enhance climate resilience and adaptation, and also incentivize the adoption and enforcement of the newest editions of hazard-resistant building codes. The eligible applicants include states, territories, federally recognized tribes, and the District of Columbia. The sub-applicants that include communities and local municipalities will apply through some of the applicants that are mentioned previously. The cost share of the program is 75% of federal funding and 25% of non-federal funding. But in the case of disadvantaged communities, like economically disadvantaged rural communities as defined in the Stafford Act, FEMA will provide 90% of the funds. And FEMA will also provide 100% of the management cost associated to the projects. There are 2 types of activities, and this is important to understand. One is mitigation projects, and these are submitted to the national competition. And the national competition projects are evaluated using the technical and qualitative criteria, but they're also evaluated to ensure that all of them are technically feasible and cost-effective. The second group is capability and capacity building activities. And these are eligible under the state territory allocation and the tribal set-aside. This is not a real competition. This is an amount of money that is provided to the applicants to fund specific activities. This includes, for example, building code activities like adoption or implementation of new codes, enhancing existing codes, partnership activities, project scoping activities to develop some projects that can become developing all the information of the project that can be used to support a sub-application to BRIC in the following cycle. And also mitigation planning and planning related activities are eligible as well. Now talking a little bit about flood mitigation and what do we see in BRIC in the years that we have been operating. So flood protection and flood mitigation are of course eligible under BRIC. In fiscal year 2021, the last one we evaluated, the number of submitted sub-applications that reported flooding as the primary hazard represented about 50%. In the national competition, nearly 2/3 of the projects that were selected last year reported flooding as a primary or secondary hazard. So as you can see, flooding is a very important component on the funding for the BRIC program. And it covers a wide range of solutions, project types to deal with the flooding problem. For example, we've seen projects that deal with riverine, stormwater, rainwater, coastal flooding, relocation of pumping stations, critical infrastructure, drainage, conveyance, stormwater capacity and storage, relocation of sewer pumps that are suffering flooding, and new construction of diversion of hydraulic structures for example, culverts and outfalls, spillways. All these types have been already evaluated, and some of these projects selected. Roads that flood and either being protected or elevated, protection for flooding for commercial or residential properties, and that this could be achieved in multiple ways: floodproofing, floodplain restoration, relocation, elevation, levees, berms. So it's a wide range of eligible projects to mitigate flooding that have been already selected and funded through BRIC. So we're really encouraged to see more and more coming from the different regions and states for the following years. I mean, BRIC is the program that I'm more familiar with, but FEMA has other programs that also provide funds for flooding, for mitigation of flooding problems. For example, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program uses 90 to 100% of the funding for repetitively flood damaged buildings that they are insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. So the idea here is to reduce costs to the National Flood Insurance Fund by taking some of these repetitive damaged buildings and do something about it. And within the flood mitigation assistance, there's also two new programs: the Swift Current program, which is in the first stages as well, and has an initial what they try to do is make flood mitigation assistance available within the disaster recovery framework as well. So not like BRIC or FMA that is completely pre-disaster. This is also just after disaster during the recovery time. And so far, 4 states have been receiving some funding from the Swift Current. In this case, it was Louisiana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And they were selected because of the amount of repetitive losses that they have in their states with insured properties. And there is another program called the Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Management, STORM, which is a revolving loan fund program that can be also used to receive funds for local governments for projects and activities related to mitigation of natural hazards. Finally, there is one more program that is authorized by Congress, which is the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Congressionally Directed Spending, and is associated to Congress. And this year, for example, the Consolidated Appropriation Act of 2023 authorized funding for 100 projects that are going to be part of this program. This is all we do in FEMA. I focus more on BRIC and show you how BRIC is very focused as well on flood mitigation. I hope this helps you to get an idea. There's a lot more information in our website, and if you have any other question about our programs or how to support your needs, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you, Commissioner.
Rafael, thank you very much. That was really great information about what FEMA is doing. So we all appreciate that. So we'll move on to the next speaker, which will be Marissa. So Marissa, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm Marissa Ramos, and I'm honored to be representing the Florida Public Service Commission today, especially given the relevancy of this topic for Florida with our exposure and history to extreme weather events like hurricanes. With that being said, Florida has a pretty robust storm preparedness program, which does include flood mitigation efforts for several companies. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to focus on the Public Service Commission storm protection plans. I'll refer to them also as SPPs. But what the SPPs are, they're essentially a roadmap of the utilities' planned storm hardening activities for the immediate 10-year planning period. And my objective today is to just give a high-level overview of the content requirements and criteria considerations of these plans, and then finish off by getting into some of the specific programs that some of the companies have that focus on flood mitigation. So currently, the Public Service Commission is governed by our storm protection rule and statute. And this requires Florida's IOUs to file an SPP, Storm Protection Plan, with the commission for their approval at least every 3 years. And based on our rule requirements, the commission's able to review each IOU's SPP on a program level basis. So they get pretty detailed. And essentially for the requirements, the IOUs are required to provide the who, what, when, how for each program. For example, the cost estimates of the program, a description of the program's affected facilities and customers, and the outage histories associated with them. Also, how the program is designed to enhance the utility's existing infrastructure. So from the commission's perspective, they are guided by our SPP statute when determining whether the IOU's SPP is in the public interest. And based on the statute, there's 4 main objectives that they should be looking at, which is the extent to that the plan is expected to reduce restoration times and restoration costs and outage times associated with extreme weather events, how feasible, reasonable, or practical the plan may be, as well as the estimated costs and benefits of the proposed improvements, as well as the estimated annual rate impact from that plan implementation if it is approved. So jumping into the plan specifics, we recently just finished a cycle, if you will, of the SPPs where the commission evaluated proposed SPPs from the companies. And as far as flood mitigation goes, the companies are relocating or elevating substations to combat flood mitigation. And if those options aren't possible, we're also seeing that these substations are being completely rebuilt or relocated, and storm protection walls are also being built to surround the substations if some other options aren't possible or feasible. In addition to substations, we're seeing that companies are also hardening existing underground line equipment to better withstand storm surge. And they're just doing this by installing waterproof equipment, replacing conventional switchgear with submersible switchgear, some efforts like that. So overall, these SPPs are being filed, like I said, at least every 3 years. The companies are also required to file an annual SPP report with the commission, and that essentially just keeps us up to date as far as how the programs are going. They include the estimated actual projects that they plan to complete that year and the following year, as well as the money that they've spent doing so. And these annual reports can be found on our website. The purpose of the SPP docket that I just spent the past few minutes discussing, I just want to reiterate that that is just, they're just seeking approval, commission approval for the overall roadmap. A separate annual cost recovery docket is conducted where the commission addresses the cost recovery portion associated with those programs. So that completes my presentation. I hope that kind of gave you a good insight of how we are addressing storm preparedness issues here at the Florida Public Service Commission. And I will stick around to the end for further discussion and questions.
Thank you, Marissa. Before we move on, I did have one question about something that you said. You talked about sometimes the utilities are not able to relocate and elevate their substations. Is that due to cost issues, or are there physical issues that prevent them from relocating or elevating their substations?
I would say a mixture of both.
Okay. Okay. And the physical reason, what would be some of the physical reasons that would prevent relocation or elevating of substations, if you know?
I would say to be honest, I think that the most common way with the substation, they're elevating it first, And relocating or rebuilding is definitely a second option, just more because of the cost of it.
Okay.
That plays a big role. With the storm protection plans, with all the programs that go into this, one of the big issues that we are concerned with is the cost. You know, these hardening programs are very expensive, and we're very aware that those costs are passed on to the ratepayers.
Yeah. Well, Marissa, thank you very much. I meant to keep the questions to the end, but as you finished, I had a question of my own about what you were talking about. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dean, who is our third speaker.
Thank you, Commissioner. Unlike my counterpart from Florida, New Jersey is not nearly as susceptible to hurricanes as they are. We don't see them as frequently, and as such, the flood mitigation was primarily focused on the rivers and coastal areas that New Jersey had prior to the major storms that hit us in 2011 and 2012. The first of which, Hurricane Irene, which by the time it reached New Jersey was actually a tropical storm, was the largest storm we had been affected by prior to I guess Hurricane Floyd, which was back in maybe 2003. That was our largest storm and identified a number of areas that were susceptible to flooding that previously hadn't been considered areas of concern. That led our board, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, to issue an order that had something in the line of 109 recommendations on storm performance. One section of which dealt specifically with substation flooding and required each of our electric distribution companies, or EDCs, to perform a flood storm analysis for all of their substations, primarily the ones that did flood, but also for all of the substations within their operating footprints. They were to prepare reports for the board to be reviewed and contain cost-benefit analyses for prospective mitigation efforts. That was in 2011, leading to 2012. And while all that was a great idea, then we got hit with Hurricane Sandy and made all of those recommendations all the more relevant. So these orders were put forth in 2012, shortly after Sandy, and our EDCs came in with their reporting, with their reports evaluating flood mitigation risk for all of their equipment. In New Jersey, we have a process in which our EDCs can have an accelerated cost recovery, which is our infrastructure improvement and recovery program, or infrastructure investment programs is how we typically call them in our filings. The IIPs are specifically designed to deal with infrastructure improvements focused entirely on resiliency, reliability, and safety. And one of the drivers for that also is that these improvements cannot be revenue producing. So these can't be system expansions or capacity expanding projects typically. This process allows us to review the projects offered by the EDCs prior to giving the board approval for these projects to proceed. So these projects are reviewed by staff based on their merits, whether or not they will address reliability, resiliency, and safety, or specifically to improve those efforts. In the course of this effort to review all of the potential flood risks out there, the EDCs proposed a number of IIPs. Our largest utility in particular proposed has 2 programs. These IIPs are designed to be 5-year programs, and the costs are rolled in on a typically on an annual basis for the equipment put into service and is used and useful at that time. And then whatever costs are remaining at the end of the program are recovered through normal base rates through a rate case. Right now, there's been 2 series of programs conducted by our largest utility, which is PSE&G. New Jersey is one of, if not the most densest populated states in the country. So in the CBAs performed by the utilities, the typical response for how to address flood mitigation has been to raise the substations. And in these programs, that's primarily what's been done. For us in particular, the location of the substations to dense populations don't lend themselves to be relocated, and the costs tend to be prohibitively high to do that. So that's been the methodology performed in New Jersey. In a very rare instances, there are flood walls, but those are very specific. That process has been going on since shortly after 2012. So we're still in the process of addressing elevating substations. At this point, we have addressed the substations that were affected by those storms, and a number that were at risk, based on, again, the risk analysis performed by the EDCs. And each of these cases are negotiated on a per petition basis. They also have a prudency review performed after the program's completed, and they roll those rates back into base rates in a rate case. So it gives our engineering division kind of 2 bites at the apple to review the merits of these projects, number one, before they're put in place, and then also a prudency review to make sure that they're performing as intended. The most recent, just recently, we got another IIP from one of our utilities who has a number of substations along coastal areas, which are in designated flood zones. And that's our primary driver for determining whether or not these projects are worthwhile. They should at least be in a flood zone. But in areas that hadn't flooded before, have no previous history of flooding, the areas along the coast in particular are susceptible to future sea level rise as a concern. It's something we're beginning to look at very closely. And those are projects in the more current times that we're looking at and considering more seriously going forward. Again, the concerns we had from the prior hurricanes at this point have been mostly addressed. And there are a number of projects that come in from time to time that have to do with raising equipment that would be considered ancillary to the actual transformers themselves. Backup batteries and control rooms or control equipment and such, which the risk of losing, while there's a risk of losing them, the ability to replace them is far easier than obviously a transformer. I also want to mention that in New Jersey and with the Board of Public Utilities, we have a dedicated staff for emergency management issues. That's where I originally come from. And they deal directly with the State Office of Emergency Management and coordinate with our other state emergency management partners in the other agencies, as well as our FEMA Region 2 representatives on all these issues. Our state has done a lot of work and preparedness work in regard to any number of hazards, and flood mitigation being a big one that's come up over the years. So, we're well engaged with our FEMA partners, our Department of Energy partners, and in some cases as well, other state agencies are brought into the fold for these type of discussions to be had. I know there's been a number of tri-state area conferences for New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania to discuss issues that are mutually beneficial for all of us. With that, I think that's it, Commissioner.
Thank you, Dean, very much. And I have a number of questions to ask of our speakers, but I think that they would appreciate and like to answer questions from those who are listening to this presentation. So please go ahead and send any questions you have and put them in the Q&A box so that we can ask those questions and address them. But in the meantime, while we wait for those questions, Dean, my first question is to you. As I was listening to what you were saying about what's happening in New Jersey, you said that your utilities are, the resiliency measures are more focused on raising or elevating the substations and the critical equipment. But not much work is being done with flood walls or barriers, except for, I think you said, in very site-specific locations. Can you elaborate on what the reason for not choosing that type of measure of not installing flood walls?
I think it's mostly a technical issue where the flood walls at the locations as they are cited don't lend themselves to use of flood walls. And I think in the grand scheme of things, I believe that raising the equipment is probably a cheaper option than the installation of flood walls. Mm-hmm. I know there's limitations on space. It depends on the size and scope of the substation, whether or not they have the room to do those types of installations. That's always a concern. And it has seemed there's been a lot of success in performing elevations as opposed to more cost effectively than the flood walls.
Thank you. That's a good, helpful explanation. So my next question is for Raphael, and then I think the rest of them is for everyone, whoever wants to answer the question. But so for Raphael, you talked a little bit about some clean energy projects with FEMA. And so the question I have is about federal assistance and about how federal assistance for enhancing these community and grid resilience, how it can contribute to utility planning as we transition to a cleaner and more resilient grid.
Yeah, I didn't mention in my presentation one additional sub-program, if you want to call it, which is becoming really, really popular and large, which is the direct technical assistance that BRIC also provides. So communities that they don't have the bandwidth to develop the projects or develop their planning, they can also from FEMA, from the
I think that we're losing Raphael.
And develop the complete project. Yeah, I think I'm back, right?
Yes, you're back. We lost you for a minute. So if you could just back up for a minute for probably the last minute and say what you were saying, because we lost you altogether.
So let me take the video out just in case it helps.
Okay.
So yeah, I was talking about the direct technical assistance support. And in those cases, when we support the communities, we are also encouraging to use more environmentally sound technologies, nature-based solutions, definitely to protect them not just from the hazards today, but for the future hazards based on climate, like Dean talked before about incorporating climate into the projects and into the solutions. Did you lose me again?
No, we can still hear you, but thank you very much for that information. We've been able to hear you the entire time. So my next question is probably a little bit more geared to Marissa and Dean, but we've talked about some of the resilience measures of raising substations, relocating equipment that's located in flood-prone areas, and then also the walls or the barriers around substations. In North Carolina, we're also seeing that that Duke Energy is working to what they call hardening their transmission poles and towers from corrosion from the floodwaters. Is that something that's being done in Florida and New Jersey as well? And Rafael, I see you're nodding your head, so you may have something to say as well about that.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go right ahead. Mm-hmm.
I was gonna say that we have also seen some of those projects coming in, and they have been funded as well.
Okay, great. And Dean, are you seeing that in New Jersey?
I'm not aware of that being a major concern at this point. A lot of that type of equipment is located in areas outside of areas really susceptible to flooding. It's primarily, our concern has primarily been with the substations in and of themselves.
Okay. And Marissa, what about in Florida?
I have a similar response as Dean. I'm not aware of any, but they are not that are currently being run through the storm protection plans, but they may be doing that. That may be an effort, but not specifically identified in those storm protection plans.
Okay. And then Marissa, since you responded last, I'll ask you first. The measures that we've talked about to provide improved resiliency of the system, which is your commission or your utilities finding to be the most cost effective in in Florida?
I wouldn't cost effect. We've only been doing these storm protection plans for a few years. So it's hard to say as far as cost effective, but I can say that the utilities are prioritizing certain substations and certain mitigation efforts over others at those specific substations. And they're doing that by installing flood alarms at some substations to track data that way. And also we have a company that conducted an engineering study using historical data to simulate storms to get a better idea of which methods may work better for certain substations and certain assets.
Okay. And Dean, what about in New Jersey?
Well, we're constantly looking at, and I know FEMA is constantly revising their flood maps. So areas where flooding is a concern or may become a concern, we're always trying to be aware of the changes that are occurring with those maps and the new hazards over time. As far as cost-effective measures, again, our most common response to flood mitigation has been elevation of the substations. That being said, if you're going to do a strict cost-benefit analysis or probability of how often a station is going to flood, there's an argument to be made that we had 2 storms within 2 years that had dramatic effects on flooding, and there hasn't been one since up to date. So it's hard to do a strict, how much money was saved over that time analysis on that basis. It's
Okay.
it's kind of the Achilles heel of all preparedness efforts. You do these you do these measures to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if there hasn't been a risk to it again, you're always second guessing whether that was a correct decision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so we have two questions in the question and answer box. And the first one is a question for Marissa related specifically to Florida. And the question is, how often are the SPPs updated? And are they generally reviewed by the commission and approved?
So the utilities are required to file an SPP a minimum at least every 3 years. They can file within that 3-year period, but at least every 3 years, the companies are required to file them with the commission for commission approval.
And I think that the question was also for approval, are they typically approved as well, or does that remain to be seen?
We've gone through 2 cycles now of the SPPs. This rule and statute came about in 2019, so it's fairly new. But both the first round of SPPs resulted in a settlement agreements, which the commission ultimately approved. And then this last go around, the commission had some modifications to the utilities proposed plans. So sometimes the commission will go ahead and modify their proposed plans as they see fit before overall approving them.
Okay. And then the second, I think, related question is for both Dean and Marissa. And the question is for Florida and New Jersey, do the commissions in the respective states require emergency preparedness plans? Not necessary only plans dedicated to storms, but rather to any emergency. And if yes, are they enacted in rules? So Dean, I'll turn this over to you to see if you have a response to that in New Jersey first.
Right. So again, our analysis from Hurricane Irene involved a in-depth study of storm response and the utilities response, a top-down approach, a top-down analysis on their response to these storms, from personnel, training, executive level, in addition to the equipment and the overall response. So part of that was to have them have these emergency preparedness plans that deal with any number of issues. They're usually our order required them to have these plans. It's not by statute or rule, but an order that required them to have the plans, and they tend to be agnostic to the cause. It's, in New Jersey, our position is it's an all hazards approach. So whether it's flooding, terrorism, storms, the approach doesn't necessarily change. The cause of the emergency doesn't change the response. Just the scale of the issue does. So, and the board does. They don't require it. They can be sensitive in nature, so the board doesn't necessarily have copies of them, but we've had access to them to review them as well.
Okay. Thank you. And Marissa, what about in Florida?
Yes, the companies definitely have emergency preparedness plans. We require them to have capacity shortage and fuel emergency response plans, and that is required by rule. Okay,
great. And so the next question that I had, and Raphael, I may start with you if this is something that's in the purview of FEMA, and then move on to Marissa and Dean. But what about utilities using smart grid or self-healing grid technologies for flooding or flooding mitigation? Is that something that that FEMA is focusing on or is seeing?
At least in our program, we haven't seen any of those type of projects. We start seeing a lot of microgrids, and we start seeing like grids that are developed with redundant solutions, including even solar or other type of sources, more environmental sources, so that you have multiple resources in case of any hazard happen, any storm. But self-healing, I'm not familiar with that one, and I haven't seen that one in particular.
Yeah, and you moved on to my next question, so I'll ask because I was going to be asking about microgrids or mini grid investments. So I'll ask about that in a minute of Dean and Marissa as well. But Marissa, how about in Florida about smart grid technologies? Is that something you're seeing much of?
Not so much. I mean, I touched on it a little bit before about companies maybe using flood alarms at some of the substations, but I'm not sure I would consider that smart grid technology. I think the flood alarms would just alert the operator and go from there. So I'm not sure that would be categorized as smart grid.
Okay. And Dean, what about in New Jersey?
Our IIP programs tend to draw a lot of smart grid projects, particularly distribution automation, and primarily sensors, capacitor bank, smart capacitor banks and such. So yes, we see a lot of that in New Jersey. That's been another primary driver for these infrastructure investment plans. That was ultimately the goal of putting these rules in effect, was to drive investment in programs that the utilities may not otherwise do without an incentive for faster recovery. So those are the type of projects in particular that, when I look for when I look through petitions, that's what we're looking for, is for these type of upgrades in particular.
Okay. Great. And so I'm going to move on to what Rafaela just touched on about microgrids. And we are seeing in North Carolina that Duke Energy has constructed and is proposing some microgrids to address problems with outages due to severe weather. So Marissa, I'll begin with you. Is that something that is happening in Florida now, that's being proposed and approved and constructed?
I would say not as part of our storm protection plans. The best example I can give, recently the commission approved a pilot program for Tampa Electric Company, where they were involved in the construction of a neighborhood. It was a small neighborhood, about 37 homes, and where there were solar panels installed at each house, a backup generator at the substation, and also that community had the grid interconnect as well. So there's three facets. The intention of that is to increase reliability and reduce system losses, but they just finished construction on it. We haven't had the data reported to us yet, so not too sure yet on how that will affect reliability going forward, but that would be the best example I could give for Florida as far as microgrid.
Okay. Great. And then I have a question. I think, Marissa, this will be for you, because Dean has said that these walls or barriers around substations is not something that is really that they're seeing much of in New Jersey. But in North Carolina, our public utility, Duke Energy, they've been doing something really interesting that they call tiger dams. And so for the tiger dam methodology is that they have constructed these temporary modular flood walls. And then they are able to move these modular flood walls from location to location in advance of storm events. And they're doing that because we know that building these barriers or the flood walls is very expensive. So this has been a less expensive and temporary solution to protect against their substations in areas that we know a storm is coming. Is that something that Florida is doing?
Not yet. That's definitely an interesting approach. I mean, it's interesting and a different point of view to go ahead and tackle that issue, but we have not seen that yet.
And Dean, I assume you have not, but just in case you have, I thought I'd at least mention it.
No, that's not something that we've heard much of. I mean, we were still back in the sandbagging days, back going back, so that was the temporary measure that was done as far as I recall.
Okay. And then another question that I have is related to this energy transition that our states are going through and experiencing. And in the past, for reliability during storm events, we focused on how outages affected businesses and residential customers. But with our energy transition and the increased level of distributed energy resources on the system, and then we're going to be getting a substantial amount of electric vehicles. These outages that we've historically seen are now going to be affecting the ability of DERs to function and provide power, and then also for customers to charge their vehicles. And so that's kind of a long lead in to my question about are the three of you seeing that the utilities or the commissions are starting to think about impacts due to outages in a greater or different way, and that the response may need to evolve based upon this energy transition and what we're dealing with? And so, Dean, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to start?
Sure. So in New Jersey, we've been aggressively implementing solar in our state, in addition to the programs that we're trying to get our wind farms up and running. The goal, the governor came out with a very aggressive request to reduce greenhouse gas emissions faster than our that were previously requested, from 2050 to 2035 to reach our CO2 goals. So the idea that we're going to get there through the normal course of business is not really a reality for us at this point. So there's been an effort to approach this by reaching out to stakeholders to see what their position is on grid modernization. We have a grid modernization stakeholder process going on right now to help try to find ways to use technology, DER, storage, all the evolving technologies out there to help address the needs of an ever-increasing electric state that we're going to become, trying to get away from fossil fuels. The only other option is to run things with electricity, and that's going to entail either a vast investment in infrastructure to support that increased load, or innovative technologies on how to rebalance and shift that load around and the generation required to support it. So we're well aware of that need, and we're in a pretty substantial process right now with our grid mod stakeholder process. There are rules being created right now to require our EDCs to come up with plans on how to achieve the amount of growth that's going to be required to support these efforts. So I'm not really the person to talk about it. Our clean energy folks are the real experts in this field, but I'm doing some surrogate duty on their behalf. But that's essentially where New Jersey is. These are things that we've been thinking about for some time and been working on extensively.
Great. And Raphael, would you like to provide a response?
I think that is a little bit beyond what we are doing right now. I mean, what we see microgrids, and we see some alternative sources of energy that they are requested in the projects. But what we see a lot is the immediate needs for people to prepare for disasters, like generators. There's a lot of generator projects that some cases we will prefer if they are combined with some new sources of energy, but at the end, whatever the communities are in real need right now for the next storm. And that is what they're requesting in general. So we're not as advanced as New Jersey, thinking forward so much into the future.
Mhm. And Marissa, we've got just a few minutes left, and I have one more question, but did you want to add anything to respond to this question?
No, this isn't my area of expertise particularly, but I would say that sounds like it's a little bit beyond what we currently have going on here at the Florida Public Service Commission as well.
Okay. And so looks like we have about 2 more minutes. And so my last question for each of you is, do you have any key or important takeaways that you want to provide to the commissioners or commission staff who are on this webinar that to end with that you think are particularly important to take home to their commissions? And Marissa, let's begin with you.
Sure. I think that, you know, as important as storm hardening is, the biggest takeaway that I'd like to say is just, it's a balance. I know the Public Service Commission, that's, you know, our intention is to balance, but it's to minimize storm damages, outages, and restoration times. But I think it's also important to consider how expensive these storm hardening activities truly are. And I mean, a big takeaway is we can continue to harden a system, but no system is going to be completely bulletproof. Every storm is different. Every system is different. And just keep that in mind as we move through different storm protection plans and continue to harden that. They are expensive endeavors.
Mm-hmm. And Raphael?
You know, we want to keep promoting these pre-storm projects, and mitigation is very important. Your states, the 3 of you, I mean, they are really active into these grants with FEMA and coming up with very good ideas and very good projects. We want to see the whole country really getting ready for this and see more sub-applications from everybody the next cycle.
Thank you. And Dean?
I would echo Marissa's statement about the costs of these programs. You know, we're always cognizant of the costs being borne for these programs, and we try to avoid what we'll consider at some point. You do reach a point of diminishing returns, and a level of what I'll call gold plating a system to deal with problems that at some point you're not going, there's never going to be a zero outage grid. And I think recognizing that and recognizing that there's cost benefit analyses and other types of probabilities that'll tell you whether or not the costs and the risks are warranted, have to always be in the back of the mind, because our EDCs are always eager to invest in additional infrastructure.
Well, we are now totally out of time. I knew that this was going to be interesting and informative, but I have to say that I have learned a lot about work that's being done at FEMA and in New Jersey and in Florida. So thank you to Raphael, Marissa, and Dean. Great job on this, providing information on this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.